another episode of Sounds Reasonable. I'm your host, Dr. Brad, and I'm joined in the production of our weekly show by Tim and Tracy. However, Tracy is ill this week, so Sally has kindly jumped in for her. Welcome, Sally, to Sounds Reasonable.
Thanks, Brad.
We're all members of the Free Thought community, and our Sounds Reasonable website can be found on Facebook. Do you experience frequent irrational thoughts, a pervasive belief in a divine sky daddy, an insatiable urge to read horoscopes, perform spells, speak in tongues, or pray? Fortunately, you are now listening to the cure for these ailments, Sounds Reasonable. This show is dedicated to bringing you, the listener, the latest news in free thought, science, logic and reason, and politics and religion. And of course, we encourage you to share your thoughts with us after each episode by posting comments and asking questions on our Facebook page. What is free thought? What does it mean to be a free thinker? The dictionary definition is a person who forms opinions about religion based on reason, independent of tradition, authority, or established belief. Here's Christopher Hitchens' working definition. Our belief is not a belief. Our principles are not a faith. We do not rely solely upon science and reason because these are necessary rather than sufficient factors. But we distrust anything that contradicts science or outrages reason. We may differ on many things, but what we respect is free inquiry, open-mindedness, and the pursuit of ideas for their own sake. We'll now move on to our science news segment, and remember that the scientific mind is one that allows its perceptions of reality to be constrained by good evidence and good argument. Ever since the dawn of modern-day genetics and the understanding of the concept of the gene, the geneticist has dreamed of being able to go into an individual afflicted with a genetic disorder and correct the underlying mutation. Until recently, this has not been possible. However, the development of a new technology called CRISPR is about to change all that. Now, one major difficulty in treating genetic disorders in this fashion is having a suitable way to introduce the functional gene. When you have a gene that must function in every cell, this is a challenge we currently cannot overcome. However, if you only need to change a gene in one cell type, and that cell type can be easily cultured outside the body, this makes for a very attractive target. This is the case for some genetic disorders of the blood. You start by isolating stem cells from the bone marrow. And a stem cell is a cell that has the potential to become any cell type. But when these are isolated from the bone marrow, they become blood cells. The target gene for a couple of key disorders, known as beta thalassemia or sickle cell anemia, is the beta globin gene, a key component of hemoglobin. And remember what hemoglobin is. It's the key molecule that transports oxygen throughout the body. Now, most of the adult hemoglobin consists of 2 beta chain proteins and 2 alpha chain proteins. However, your body does not start out producing hemoglobin in this manner. Instead, it proceeds through several stages as the embryo and fetus mature all the way to birth. So if I could have the first figure, please, Tim. Okay, so this figure illustrates the organization of the alpha genes, which are found on chromosome 16. So that's the top linear array. And those little boxes represent individual alpha globin genes. And then immediately below it, the second linear array found on chromosome 11 are the beta globin genes. Now, what you'll note is that we need at least, or excuse me, we need two alpha genes and two beta genes to make a functional hemoglobin molecule. So going down to the bottom of the slide, so if you would please, Tim, show folks where the embryonic hemoglobins are. Okay, so you'll note that the very first hemoglobin molecule that we have is comprised of what's described as a zeta chain. So that's what that little squiggly line is. So that's your alpha globin component when you're an embryo. And then the epsilon chain, which is your beta globin gene component, again, when you're an embryo. This then matures, shall we say, to the zeta and gamma chains. So that's what the hemoglobin Portland represents. And then that matures further to the alpha 2, epsilon 2 form. Okay, again, all during embryonic development. Okay, so these are going to be the forms of hemoglobin that you would have in the developing embryo through about week 16 or so. After that, we then develop the fetal form. Okay, so again, we have two alpha chains. Okay, so alpha 2. And then the beta chains that are represented here are the gamma chains. And then finally, when we reach birth, okay, we switch from gamma chain production to delta and beta chains. And as you proceed towards adulthood, the alpha 2, beta 2 form is the predominant form. About 98 to 99% of your hemoglobin is in that form, but you still retain some alpha 2, delta 2 as an adult. Now, the inheritance pattern of both beta thalassemia and sickle cell anemia are the same. So if I could have the next figure, please, Tim. Okay, so starting with the location of the beta globin genes. So remember again that those are on chromosome 11. Both of these disorders are known as a recessive type. Okay, so that means that you must have, to exhibit the syndrome in its full effect, you must have two copies of the defective gene. So starting at the top, okay, we have a father and mother, okay, each of which have a normal beta globin gene that's indicated by the open box, open rectangle, and then a defective one, which is indicated by the rectangle with an X through it. Now, both of these individuals will exhibit some mild anemia, but in essence, they are phenotypically or observationally normal. Now, when they have children, okay, they have a 1/4 chance, okay, so one chromosome, one normal chromosome from the father, one from the mother, of having a unaffected child. All right, so that's shown on the left. They have a 1/2 chance of having a child that will be a carrier, that is just one gene affected. So those children will mimic the phenotypes of the parents. And then finally, we have a 1/4 chance of having an individual, having a child that will exhibit the moderate to severe form of anemia. Okay, and that occurs when both beta globin genes are non-functional. And again, this works the same for both beta thalassemia and sickle cell anemia. Now, depending on the severity of the beta globin gene mutations, the pathology of the disease varies. So if I could have the next figure, Tim. Okay, so if we simply have reduced levels of beta globin chains, that is, we have one defective gene and one normal gene, then the alpha globin chains will not be in extreme excess. Okay, so remember that again, hemoglobin is composed of 2 alpha and 2 beta chains. So the alpha globin chains will not be in extreme excess and will not cause extensive damage resulting in acute anemia. However, if both beta globin chains are absent, so that's the scenario shown on the right-hand side, okay, then we have extreme excess of alpha globin chains, and this results in much more severe anemia. Now, depending on which of these outcomes occurs, that dictates how you must treat the disorder. So prior to what we're going to discuss today, the most common means was blood transfusion, okay, to alleviate the condition. Alternatively, if you had the more mild form, some other potential treatments were possible. Now, with beta thalassemia, the strategy was to turn back on the gamma globin gene. So remember that during fetal development, okay, we have fully functional hemoglobin with 2 alpha chains and 2 gamma chains. The gamma chains being fully functional as a substitute for the beta chains. So again, this would create a functional hemoglobin molecule consisting of 2 alpha chains and 2 gamma chains in the form of the fetal hemoglobin. Now, in the case of sickle cell anemia, the strategy was to reverse the mutation in the beta globin gene itself. So can I have the last figure, please, Tim? Okay, so let's start at the bottom. Okay, so the bottom portion of the figure shows the most common mutational change that results in sickle cell anemia. So the normal cell will have that GLU as the amino acid at this position, whereas the sickle cell will have a VAL substituted for that GLU. So note that it only takes a single base change to result in the amino acid change that gives us sickle cell anemia. So in the case of, again, sickle cell anemia, we're simply going to change that single base in the form of a T, or excuse me, in the form of an A back to the T. Okay, so if you kind of indicate that, Tim, yeah, so there's the A, we're going to change back to the T in these individuals, correct the mutation, and alleviate the syndrome. Now, these 2 manipulations were carried out using CRISPR technology, which Tim will now describe.
Okay, so the article that I'm discussing this afternoon comes from New Scientist, June 12th, 2020. And the title was 3 people with inherited diseases successfully treated with CRISPR. This article focuses on the use of CRISPR and the CRISPR in a gene editing role to inactivate defective hemoglobin genes. CRISPR, which stands for clustered regularly interspaced short palindromic repeats, was used on bone marrow stem cells of 3 individuals. The 2 had beta thalassemia and 1 had sickle cell anemia. By gene editing their bone marrow stem cells, the 3 individuals no longer needed blood transfusions, which is, as Dr. Brad talked about, which is a common method for treating people with both of these inherited genetic diseases. Results of the ongoing trial, which is the first to use CRISPR to treat inherited genetic disorders, were announced at a virtual meeting of the European Hematology Association. A team member Haydar Fangul, if I'm pronouncing that right, at Sarah Cannon Research Institute in Nashville, Tennessee, announced, quote, "The preliminary results demonstrate, in essence, a fundamental cure for patients with beta thalassemia and sickle cell disease," end quote. What was interesting is that what was been known to be interesting, there's always been a few people with disease-causing mutations that never show any symptoms. And that was because they kept producing fetal hemoglobin into adulthood. And so normally, as Dr. Brad talked about, normally fetal hemoglobin stops being produced soon after birth. So based on this fact, the researchers developed treatment designed to boost fetal hemoglobin. In the treatment, they developed bone marrow stem cells. In the treatment they developed, bone marrow stem cells were first removed from the individuals, and then the gene that turns off fetal hemoglobin production was disabled using CRISPR. Now, the next thing they had to do then was to remove any of the bone marrow stem cells that were in those individuals, and so they did that by using chemotherapy, and then they replaced and added new bone stem cells with the CRISPR edited bone stem cells, bone marrow stem cells. The first two patients with beta thalassemia, that had beta thalassemia, 15 months and 5 months post-treatment, no longer need blood transfusions. And the same is true 9 months post-treatment for the patient that had sickle cell disease. Now, of course, the three patients did experience some adverse side effects due to the chemotherapy. And I guess a common chemotherapy side effect in this situation is infertility. But the CRISPR gene editing appears to be safe. Obviously, the patients will more than likely need to be monitored probably for the rest of their lives to be sure that there are no adverse side effects. But so far, really good news. Altogether now, 5 people have been treated. This trial had been put on hold because of the coronavirus pandemic, but now I guess it's resumed. So you may be asking a little bit about, what is CRISPR, how does CRISPR work? And so I'll just take just a few minutes here to discuss that. So CRISPR, basically CRISPR is a complex of a protein, enzyme, and RNA. And it has the ability then to find specific DNA sequences inside the cell and then alter that piece of DNA. The key to CRISPR is the Cas proteins. And these Cas proteins were originally found in bacteria, and bacteria use Cas proteins to help defend the bacteria against viruses. The Cas9 protein is the one most commonly used by scientists. This protein can easily be programmed to find and bind to almost any desired target DNA sequence using a piece of what they call guide RNA. I'm going to go to figure 1 here. Back to my screen. So CRISPR essentially works like this. A plasmid is designed that codes for the Cas9 enzyme, protein enzyme, and the guide RNA sequence. The guide RNA sequence, which is complementary to the target DNA sequence. The plasmid then is introduced into the cell. In this case, it would have been to the stem cell. Next, the cell transcribes the guide RNA from the plasmid, and then it transcribes and translates. In other words, makes the next thing it does is makes the Cas9 protein enzyme. Then the Cas9 enzyme and the guide RNA complex together. Then next we have the Cas9 enzyme guide RNA complex binding to the target DNA sequence using a small open stretch of the guide RNA. That's what it uses to locate and bind to the target DNA sequence. And then the Cas9 enzyme cuts both strands of the target DNA. Okay. So what happens next, and I need to go to figure 2. So what happens next? You have two things that could happen depending on what you want to happen. You could have the gene silencing or the gene insertion. So in this work with the beta thalassemia and the sickle cell anemia, they did a gene silencing where after the Cas9 protein cuts the target DNA, the cut is repaired by the cell's natural DNA repair mechanism within the cell. And usually what that will do then is introduce a mutation or a non-coding, produce a non-coding region there for the gene, so it disables the gene. And this is, again, the most common use for CRISPR is the gene silencing role. Now, a second thing that CRISPR can be used for is the gene insertion, where the CRISPR in this case, the CRISPR can also be used to make precise changes by replacing faulty genes. This would be considered true genome editing. And of course, this is a little more difficult. The new gene, a new gene is added to the original plasmid. So you have the plasmid with the Cas9 code sequence for the Cas9 enzyme, the guide RNA, and then you also have the insert of the new gene that you want to put in to the cell's DNA on that plasmid. And then in this case, when after the Cas9 cuts the DNA, opens up the DNA strand, then you have what we call a homologous directed repair that inserts the new gene into where the cut of the DNA has occurred. So those are the basic two, simple versions of the procedures using CRISPR. Of course, CRISPR is already widely used in the scientific research. It's not too distant future. Many of plants and animals in our farms or gardens and grocery stores may have some CRISPR editing done to those. I ran across an article where they're actually looking at doing that with rice. So they found a gene that kind of slows down the growth of grasses. And so they're using the gene editing to stop that slow growth in rice to get them to grow faster, I guess. So again, CRISPR technology, as Dr. Erickson mentioned, has the potential to really transform medicine until we're not just treating diseases or illnesses, we're actually curing them or trying to prevent them. To kind of end here, just a few facts. At least 1,000 people in the U.S. have beta thalassemia. About 1.5% of the global population, which should equate to 80 to 90 million people, are carriers for beta thalassemia. And 60,000 symptomatic individuals are born annually. Then sickle cell disease is the most common of all inherited disorders in the United States. It is, however, still a rare disease, considered still a rare disease, affecting 70 to 80,000 Americans. So, again, based on the advances in biotechnology, I think if we were to think back to the fathers of biotechnology, Frederick Griffith, Oswald Avery, Gavin MacLeod, and Macklin McCartney, I think you'd agree, Dr. Erickson, that they'd just be astounded by the progress we've made in this field.
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt about that, that they would. They would obviously also be fascinated by it as well.
Yes.
To know that they were in essence the individuals that first described DNA as the genetic material, and then now the actual dream that they themselves had of being able to correct genes directly is now being realized.
Yes. Yep. This fascinating.
Okay. Okay. Sally, any comments?
Not really. You know, a lot of that stuff, I feel like such a pedestrian.
Well, yeah, we apologize for that. We do our best to
No.
try to keep it somewhat interpretable for the layperson, but we
It's
are
exciting.
dedicated to science, so.
It is very exciting, but I do feel a little bit like a layperson when y'all delve into biology like that. But you know, there's of us out there who are.
We can't help it.
Yep, and of course, just a reminder, if our audience has questions, please post them on our page, and we will do our best to answer them. Okay, well, Tim, thanks so much for that, and we'll be back after a short break.
All alive. The devil's in the detail, lingered inside. Oh, a holy crime. But how can I hide you without an alibi? It's a rebel's fight without an alibi. You took my innocence. I can't wait no longer. I'm playing with the monsters. Everything that brought me alive. But we're all like monsters, playing with the monsters. They brought me alive without no alibi. It's a rebel's fight without an alibi. You took my innocence without an alibi.
And we're back with more Sounds Reasonable on June 28th, 2020. Anytime religion gets mixed with politics and healthcare, there's going to be trouble. I don't think there's much doubt about that. Few individuals that are against social restrictions due to COVID-2 pandemic are joining forces with anti-vaxxers. Talk about your lunatic fringe. Sally has the story. So Sally, where is this madness coming from?
Well, here in the US and I guess around the world, we do have a long history of anti-vaccination movements and disbelief in science. And that's becoming more and more prevalent as, as 2020 continues. You know, the article that we're looking at today, why some vaccine skeptics are fighting COVID-19 restrictions, and that's from June 16th, 2020 on the Religion and Politics website, which is, the article is posted, I know, in the group. But it talks a lot about how there are two movements. There's the First Amendment right movements who believe that they have a right to their body. And then there's the anti-vax movement. Two parts of that anti-vax movement are one, that your body is a temple, and two, that the vaccine, you know, might make you sicker. And it really depends on how you feel about, I think the actual epidemic is how you view whether or not the vaccinations are going to be necessary. I did highlight a few paragraphs from the article to read to y'all. Anti-vaccination movements have a long history in the US, and there are many factors that align vaccine skeptics of different religious and political persuasions. These include a distrust of medical doctors and vaccine manufacturers, perceptions of vaccine toxicity juxtaposed with the purity of godliness of the natural body, sacralized understandings of children's bodies, and a belief in the intuitive, emotion-driven expertise of mothers. In short, they engage the fundamental question of who has the authority to decide how bodies should be treated. Today, while the media often condenses people who abstain or question vaccines into the category of anti-vaxxers, we now use the PC term vaccine skepticism or pro-vaccine choice.
Not me.
For those who fear vaccine mandates, the topic of purity of body and soul is never far from the surface, even though brasher patriotic rhetoric involving freedom, rights, and liberation tends to garner more mainstream coverage of anti-vaccination movements. However, vaccine skeptics have long feared that vaccines could make them or their children sicker than the illness themselves. This perspective relies first on the concept of natural immunity, in which a person contracts a disease, becomes ill, fights it off, and in the process develops antibodies to protect her against contracting the same illness again. Secondly, it draws on the ideal of treating the body as a temple, so to speak, reflecting the wellness movements of the past few decades, including the desire to eat clean, use all natural products, and avoid contact with chemicals, genetically modified foods, or synthetic materials. In this purity culture, vaccines can be a boogeyman far more frightening than natural-born illnesses, whether measles or COVID-19. The current wave of protests against staying at home or the prospect of a mandatory COVID-19 vaccine are consistent with the responses to other public health scares, including most recently outbreaks of the measles. The idea of government-led social health policies on vaccination is anathema to many individuals who believe in private health decision-making. This animus jibes with, or even ratchets up, a distrust among vaccine skeptics who fear that the government will not only prevent everyday activities and track individuals, but also force citizens to receive a vaccine for COVID-19 if and when it becomes available. Far from seeing such a requirement as an essential public health measure for the common good, these skeptics interpret it as a violation of their civil and possibly even religious rights. Anti-COVID-19 safety logic, like vaccine skepticism, is more broadly runs the gamut from individual rights-based legal arguments to binaries between good and evil. Consequently, morality is a core component of skepticism towards public safety measures. Sitting comfortably beneath the big tent of health libertarianism, vaccine skepticism's rise in the past 30 years coincided with the growing distrust of American government, the medical establishment, and state authority in general. It is this populist questioning of authority in the form of medical science, public health mandates, and even doctors that unites evangelical Christians and libertarians on the far right and those on the left whose spiritual but not religious beliefs foster a deep-seated commitment to alternative forms of authority. This latter group, often characterized as white, upper middle class, secular, and politically liberal, does not typically utilize the language of militancy or fighting governmental tyranny in its opposition to enforced vaccination. Rather, it draws on debunked scientific studies, individual stories, and the influential testimonies of celebrities and activists, and emphasizing that their chief concerns are about vaccine safety rather than individual freedoms. Yeah, you know, I think a lot of it has to do with who you get your media from and what you choose to believe. It certainly doesn't help that we have a leader who undermines all the health authorities in the country. And this just falls right in line with what I believe is, you know, the downfall of education and knowledge in our Western civilization. And it's true, you do see both sides of these stories. Some people who believe that the government does not have a right to tell you that you need to wear a mask, or, you know, businesses should be closed. A lot of those people do tend to believe that the virus is a political narrative to discredit Trump and keep him from another term in the White House. And then there's the liberals who fall on that left side, who do believe in the spirituality of the body, and that the mother knows best, which time has definitely shown us is not always the case. Did y'all have any thoughts or?
Yeah, thanks for getting us that story, Sally. Yeah, I mean it's unbelievable that we have in essence the leader of the free world that just recently walked into a place where they manufacture the face coverings, the face masks. And what was the net result of that? They had to throw out the entire batch that was made that day. So here we have the president that will not abide by what his own medical staff is telling him, what the best health experts in the world are telling him, and of course, what would we expect, from the right? Of course, they're going to follow his lead. They're like he's bragged about many times. I could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and they'd still follow me, and it's pretty clear from this, that maybe that really is the case.
And and you just have these, like President Trump, narcissistic people that just, oh, you can't tell me what to do. I'm not going to do anything that I don't want to do. How dare you try to tell me I got to wear a mask? I'm going to wear my seatbelt. I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to do that. I don't care about anybody else. And so you run into that group, and what do? Put them in jail, I guess. Fine them.
It's funny because you always read about American individualism and how we pride ourselves so much on this individual. It's used almost as an excuse for people refusing to accept the authority that the government has granted, and we followed. These are the same people who will justify the shooting of an unarmed person because of an infraction of the law, and heaven forbid we start shooting people because they aren't publicly following anti-vaccine orders. What I also find funny is the anti-vaccine fear that vaccinations are going to become mandated, where we're seeing that insurance companies aren't even covering COVID-19 testing. And it's unlikely that, I think the president even came out in March and said that if there was a vaccine, it probably won't be available to all Americans and it will be very costly. So the idea that we're going to require a vaccine nationwide or internationally even, who's going to pay for it if that was the case? We can't even, regulate vaccines. And, it might not be a problem soon enough with the rest of the world closing their borders to us if we don't get our act together. Herd immunity might take its toll and do its own little trial here in the U.S. It's kind of a scary situation when so many people don't believe in the science that works the TVs that they watch and the cell phones that they use. And they utilize science every day, and yet they argue against the science that brought them, to this place in our society. I don't even know how to address them sometimes. Thank goodness I don't work in public anymore.
I've had people make that, well, I don't want any synthetics in my life. And I said, well, let me close my eyes while you take your clothes off.
Right. What do you eat? What do you, genetically modified food, that's like one of the biggest jokes of all, because genetic modification is what we've done for years to create corn and pretty much everything we eat.
Yeah, and again, to me, it really comes down to having a scientifically ignorant society.
Right.
Because most people don't even realize that they eat DNA every single day. regardless of what it is they're consuming, whether it be plant or animal, of course. They have no concept that their body just digests it,
Yep.
treats it as food, and it doesn't matter if you add an extra gene or take a gene out.
Right.
Your body will not react to that in any type of adverse way. And trying to get that explained is incredible. First of all, they don't even want to listen.
Right.
They just want to be right, and that's also a big problem.
Mhm.
I don't know if you've heard about the book called The Death of Expertise. I read that this past year. It's really good. Anyway, to our listeners, you might want to grab a copy of that and give it a look.
Yeah,
Okay.
it definitely seems like defunding education is getting that crowd where they want to go. If there's a conspiracy theory that I believe in, it's the defunding of education for a stupider populace. That's the sheeple.
I would agree, Sally.
I know I'm a little outspoken, but
Which is perfect for this show.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
so thanks so much
sheeple.
for that story, Sally. We'll be right back with some politics and religion after this break.
Messing with my head again. You had your heart set on me, but these feels, they come and go, and they come so easily. Tell me what it is about you that I can't forget, but you're breaking down my walls again just to set me free. Why do I, baby, why do I love the way you always leave me? Why do I, baby, why do I love the touch but never love the feeling? Why do I, baby, why do I love the way you always leave me? Why do I, baby, why do I love the touch but never love the feeling?
And we're back with our politics story. When it comes to healthcare workers and administrators, most of us look upon them in a very favorable light. We see them as heroes who put in long hours and deal with disease and death daily. All they ask in return is the right to be protected from disease themselves and be respected for what they do. However, some individuals out there see health officials in a different way. I'm going to relay a rather disturbing story from the June 22nd edition of the Washington Post, authored by Rachel Weiner and Ariana Shaw. And the title of the article is Amid Threats and Political Pushback, Public Health Officials Are Leaving Their Posts. Just what we need during a pandemic. For Lori Jones, the trouble began in early May. The director of a small public health department in Washington State was working with a family under quarantine because of coronavirus exposure. When she heard one family member had been out in the community, Jones decided to check in. The routine phone call launched a nightmare. Someone posted on the social media that we had violated their civil liberties and named me by name, Jones recalled. They said, let's post our address. Let's start shooting. People from across the country began calling her personal phone with similar threats. We've been doing the same thing in public health on a daily basis forever, but we are now the villains. said Jones, 64, who called the police and set up surveillance cameras at her home. Public health workers, already underfunded and understaffed, are confronting waves of protests at their homes and offices, in addition to pressure from politicians who favor a faster reopening. Lori Trammell Freeman, chief executive of the National Association of County and City Health Officials, said more than 20 health officials have resigned, retired, or been fired in recent weeks due to conditions related to having to enforce and stand up for strong public health tactics during this pandemic. Although shutdown measures are broadly popular, a vocal minority opposes them vociferously. There have been attacks on officials' race, gender, sexual orientation, and appearance. Freeman said some of the criticisms seem to be harsher for women. Marcus Plecia, chief medical officer with the Association of State and Territorial Health Officials, said attacks on health officials have been particularly awful in California, Colorado, Georgia, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. This month in California, Nicole Quick, Orange County's chief health officer, stepped down after she faced threats and protests at her home for requiring face coverings in many businesses as cases rose. The mandate, issued May 23rd, was softened to a recommendation a week later. Now look where California is.
Yeah.
Andrew Neumer, a professor of public health at the University of California, Irvine, who is part of a county task force, said it was not the first time Quick had been undermined. On March 17th, Quick issued a strict lockdown order. A day later, it was amended to add exceptions. It was couched as a clarification, but it was a walkback because of pressure from business leaders, Neumer said. Quick's departure is part of an exodus of public health officials across the country who have been blamed by citizens and politicians for the disruption caused by the coronavirus pandemic. I don't think I've ever seen anybody resign for the kinds of reasons we've seen recently, Plecia said. We are very concerned that if it continues to get worse, it's going to have major implications for who will be willing to have these jobs. Ohio's public health director, Amy Acton, shifted to an advisory role after enduring months of anger over the state's preventive measures, including armed protesters at her home, bearing messages including anti-Semitic and sexist slurs. One Republican lawmaker linked Acton, who is Jewish, to Nazi Germany. Another called her a dictator. Georgia's public health director said last month that she receives threats daily and now has an armed escort. Pennsylvania's Secretary of Health, who is transgender, has come under fire over the state's handling of the pandemic, including from a county official who resigned after saying at a recent meeting that he was tired of listening to a guy dressed up as a woman. 4 public health officials in Colorado have left their jobs recently. A day after telling political leaders in Weld County, Colorado, that their insistence on a speedy reopening, despite a high case rate and widespread transmission, was giving him serious heartburn, Public Health Director Mark Wallace got a 7:30 p.m. email. He had until 9 a.m., it said, to weigh in on guidelines for reopening businesses, churches, salons, restaurants, etc. They would go public an hour later. Wallace, who declined to comment for this report, retired soon after. Teresa Anselmo, executive director of the Colorado Association of Local Public Health Officials, said 80% of members had reported being threatened, and more than that were at risk of termination or lost funding. It's exhausting to be contradicted and argued with and devalued and demoralized all the time. And I think that's what you're seeing around the country, Anselmo said. We've seen from the top down, and we were just talking about this, we've seen from the top down the federal government is pitting public health against freedom, And to set up that false dichotomy is really a disservice to the men and women who have dedicated their lives to helping people. Not everyone is left willingly. In Colorado's Rio Grande County, Emily Brown was fired, she says, after advocating a more cautious response to the virus. I think I just finally pushed too hard, she said. There was resistance to taking steps as quickly as I felt they needed to be taken or move in directions I thought was needed to. She had been in her position for 6 years and valued being part of a close-knit rural community. But during the pandemic, she began getting threatening messages online from people she considered neighbors, including one Facebook post that referenced hanging. She became worried about whom she might run into at the grocery store. I've been surprised at who professes that vitriol so vocally on platforms like social media, she said. Derek Neal, who runs the public health department in Round Rock, Texas, and is past president of the State Public Health Workers Association, said given the virus's impact on daily life, public health was inevitably tied up in politics. But a community has to be healthy in order to be economically solvent. Boy, that is something that, I just don't get why other people don't get it. That's been lost in the politics of all this, he said. Public health workers in California have been battered publicly by business groups, citizens, and elected officials. Several have resigned. Half a dozen county leaders are leaving their positions in the coming weeks. All of them have served with distinction and in the interest of public health. California Medical Association President Peter Bertan Jr. said in a statement, "We are deeply concerned that the politics may be trumping public interest."
No pun intended.
Good pun.
There's the good news of the week, right?
Yeah.
Nothing like ending it with a pun.
Exactly. So yeah, well, I made a statement on Facebook not too long ago where I said, I've noticed that the dead and the very ill do not spend much money.
True. True.
So how is it in the interest of a functional economy to let this run rampant? I just can't understand the so-called reasoning. Other than of course Trump could care less.
Because those who can afford to stay home are the ones who want everyone else out working so they can get more money.
Yeah.
Those are the ones who are reaping off returns and not actual physical labor. And that's scary. And they are seen apparently as disposable is what it looks like. Again, defunding education for the win. Talk about who the sheeple are. You watch them go back to work here. They don't want to continue to pay for unemployment to keep businesses shut down and people are home. It's so sad.
Yeah,
and the harassment of the doctors and public workers. Mm-hmm. And it's not just the health officials nationally or state level. I have, in-laws. My sister is an ICU nurse, and her sister-in-law is a respiratory therapist here in New Orleans. And we have family members whom we have since blocked from our Facebook social media pages who have called them liars for saying that this is a serious issue. They get on and say, "We love Trump. You're a liar. This isn't really happening." And every time I talk to someone about this who follows one side of politics, they always say, "Oh, yeah. Well, who do you know that's gotten sick? Who do you know that's died?" I actually happen to know a lot of people because my aunt is dating a Mardi Gras Indian who is part of the African-American Black community here in New Orleans, and a lot of his friends have passed. People who I have gone out with, his family. So I do know a lot of people who have passed, and they always follow it up. Well, were they in nursing homes? No, these were people who are vibrantly active and out in the community. And it's really scary to see public health officials being threatened for simply doing their job. And it's furthering us in that spiral down.
Yeah, absolutely. And, this, of course, isn't the first situation that's resulted in this. The abortion issue, of course, has been another instance where we've had doctors just outright murdered.
Mm-hmm.
That happened in Wichita, a few years ago, where the doctor, the guy just walks in and literally shoots him right in his office. So.
Well, it's funny because a lot of those people in that anti-vax movement who believe that it's their choice are also pro-life.
Right.
So it's only pro-choice up until it becomes part of their religious beliefs, which is mind-numbingly frustrating that they can't see. You don't get one pro-choice and not the other.
Yeah, I was thinking about, Sally, when you were reading that article, how they think the mother's right or the person's right, the woman's right, but not their right to choose whether or not they end a pregnancy or keep a pregnancy going. So.
Well, yeah, and it's not just a pregnancy, of course. It's 18 years after, and I mean, food and education and housing, and it's not just a matter of whether or not you're gonna, let something grow on you for 9 months. It's complete. It's a complete life choice.
Yes, it is.
And of course, isn't it interesting that how the view changes the moment that fetus becomes a born child?
Right.
Defunding SNAP.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, there you have it. So I think we'll go ahead and take our last break here, and we'll be back with our crazy story of the week.
We're crazies.
Staying up when I go out, you gotta know I'm all yours. But when I say what's that about, you start slurring your words.
Wrong song.
You changed the song?
I put the wrong one up, sorry. These are going so good.
I'm feeling so hollow. Don't you know? And don't you know? I'm living in shadow. Don't you know? And don't you know? I fell for fool's gold. I fell for fool's gold. What did I know? What did I know? I fell for fool's gold. I fell for fool's gold. What did I know? What did I know? And you were fool's gold. Yes, I did. Yes, I did.
All right, so we're back with our crazy story of the week, and the name of that song, by the way, is Fool's Gold, and I always thought that was rather appropriate for the lead into the crazy story of the week. So I'm a bit hard-pressed to come up with a crazier scenario than a group of people honestly hoping for the end of the world. However, I would have to categorize millions of people as more than a group. Sally has our crazy story of the week. So Sally, tell us what craziness is going on.
Okay, Brad. Well, our crazy story of the week comes from Newsweek, and it talks about how evangelicals believe that Trump will bring about the end of the world.
Hard to argue with that, actually.
Well, and this has its roots in what's called dominionism, which is the Seven Mountains prophecy. It comes out of the book of Revelations. And it's Revelations 17, 1 through 18, which hinges on verse 9. And here is the mind which shall hath wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains. And this movement of dominionists, it really began in the 70s. And when Ronald Reagan kind of sort of, aligned the evangelical Christians with the GOP is when they really started to come a play in politics. And we saw a lot of this back in 2016 when Ted Cruz and Ron Paul, and I believe even Mitt Romney were dominionists. And they believe that, that bringing about the end of days is a good thing, which I don't even see how that is. But the belief is that if you have someone in religious power who runs the 7 heads of religion, family, education, government, media, and business, that this is the way God wants us to live. And they believe that Trump is the one who brings it up because he declared Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, thus beginning the end of days according to the biblical prophecy. Now that end of days was supposed to have started with 1,000 years of peace before. And I find that rather remarkable because in the last 1,000 years, even in the last 100 years, we have not had peace and prosperity on earth. But the idea is that the Antichrist will rise to power as a false prophet. And then after 7 years of ruling, the false prophet will be exposed and Jesus will save, and the Jewish persons will convert to Christianity, and it will all be over.
Jesus, a Jew will convert.
It would be in the eyes of Jewish people I know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I find this kind of belief very difficult to even talk with. They also believe in, this came up with the Bible of prosperity. It's part of the business, one of the business mountains is that the Bible of prosperity. And it's true that Trump has put religious zealots in charge of many of our heads of different sort of organizations. And we definitely see, religious media, religious art, and the idea that we're creating a pro-Christian nation that we were supposed to be, whatever that means. But scary, scary people. These are also probably your anti-vaxxers and the people who are creating bomb shelters up in Idaho and arguing against the government whom they elected into power. So what are you guys' thoughts?
Now, would Trump be considered the Antichrist? And then it's only going to be a four-year run instead of a 7-year run. So
he is the Antichrist. So it will be coming when he is reelected. We're looking at 2023 to be very, very scary. And of course, during the Antichrist rise, we will have plague, pestilence, and natural disasters, all of which we are seeing these days. I am one of those people who have such a hard time wrapping my head around why evangelicals like Trump so much. But I heard a really great story on NPR the other day. It was actually on Morning Edition, and they were interviewing Kristen Kobes Dumez on her book, Jesus and John Wayne, How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation. And it talks all about this book. I haven't read it yet because it just came out, but it talks all about how they can see Trump as someone who stands up for evangelicals, even though he doesn't follow what they believe to be a good person. And it's kind of that John Wayne. He's big and tough and breaks the rules, so they don't have to. Kind of view of Trump, that he's doing what he needs to do to be the beat on your chest man, and being strong, even though he doesn't necessarily respect marriage or do all of these things that respect honesty, respect other people, have empathy, help the poor, help the sick. He doesn't help the immigrants. He doesn't follow any of those biblical passages, but they need him to be this figurehead, kind of like John Wayne, to get this done.
Wouldn't you think it's almost, maybe not quite a puppet, it's almost like it was a coalition, because they convinced him that his base is what he needed to get elected. I mean, wouldn't you think that, and really, I don't know if I'd consider evangelicals really following, what I do as Jesus would do, that end of Christianity. So they could care less if he's a pussy grabber or whatever he does, and just he's doing things in the White House that they want him to do. It's almost like a little puppet for them.
He can do whatever he wants as long as he doesn't, allow people to do what needs to be done.
Well, think about the religious rights agenda over the past 30, 40 years. So what is it that they're most against? Well, they're most against abortion rights. That's probably number one. Would be my guess. And then what is it that they've seen erode, or what they consider eroding?
Marriage.
Their view of what the sanctity of marriage is, right? So one man, one woman, that's out the door. Again, this is a ridiculous notion that there's no prayer in school. It's just obviously not led, or should not be led, by the administrators or any actual employees of the school. So those three aspects, and then of course, lest I forget, teaching evolution.
Yeah.
Those aspects are have been on the agenda for them for a long time, and they see Trump as reversing all this with the judge appointees that have been taking place, at the federal level. So
200 so far. He's appointed 200 judges. That's more than any other president in their first term.
Wow. Oh, we lost you, Sally.
Oh,
There you are. Okay.
Back.
Well, gosh, thanks so much for that story. I think we'll have to wrap it up there. So just a quick programming note. Next weekend is July 4th, so we will not be producing a show next week. We will be back on July 12th with our next episode. If you have enjoyed our program, please pass the word to your friends and associates, believers and non-believers alike. Again, just a reminder that you are welcome to post questions and comments on our Facebook page. Remember, there is a big difference between having good reasons for what one accepts to be true and having bad ones. Incidentally, this is the only distinction one needs to become a strict atheist. This has been Dr. Brad for Sally and Tim saying so long.
Bye.